By the time Brunel came down to Millwall to launch the biggest ship in the world, the ship had already eaten money, sleep, patience, and a good deal of his body besides. It stood there in the grey of the Thames morning, like an offence against proportion, not a vessel at first glance, a district of iron, a long black wall with ribs and plates and weight enough to make the yard itself seem temporary. The river waited beyond it, flat and brown under a low London sky, while the ship sat sideways to the water on greased timber-ways, too broad for elegance, too heavy for easy confidence, and much too famous to fail in private. Brunel arrived before the full noise of the crowd had gathered. He liked a thing best before the world put its fingers on it. The wet boards knocked under his boots, smoke from the east drifted low. Somewhere a hammer rang out, thin and lonely in the damp, as if even iron had not yet properly woken. He kept his coat close, cigar in hand, shoulders tight with that peculiar stiffness a man acquired when he had not admitted to himself how tired he was. He stopped and looked up at the hull. There she was, vast, expensive, stubborn before she had moved an inch. A yard foreman, hands black with grease, cap in fist, came toward him carefully, as men did when they had to bring facts to someone famous. "We had checked the chains again, sir, the drums as well. She was ready as we could make her." "As you could make her," Brunel said. His voice came out clipped and dry. "Not as Providence could make her. We had no contract with Providence." The foreman gave the sort of nod working men reserved for gentlemen they respected without trusting to improve their morning. Behind them the day began to fill. Carriages rolled in. Clerks picked their way over mud with papers they were already trying to save from the air. Investors arrived in coats too fine for the yard, with hats too neat for a place where men sweated at chains thicker than a wrist. A few dignitaries carried their importance as if it were a waterproof garment. It was not. The damp found them all the same. Then came the reporters with bright eyes and quick little mouths, and then the gawpers, and then the rest of London's appetite. Nothing drew a crowd like greatness near the edge of embarrassment. That was the true weather of the morning, not the mist, not the river wind. Judgment. Brunel moved through it as if none of it touched him. He inspected the cradles, spoke to the engineers, tapped the rail with his glove, asked for figures and tolerances and loads, everything exact, everything in place, everything a machine-minded man could demand of wood, iron, screw, chain, leverage, grease, and nerve. But he could feel the eyes on him. He had been admired too publicly for too long not to know the taste of it when admiration began to sour. Delay had done its work. Expense had done its work. Whispering had done its work. The ship had grown beyond an engineering problem into a public opinion. There were now men in London who wanted her to float almost as much as they wanted Brunel to be made ridiculous trying. One bored man, smooth-faced and damp-tempered, came beside him with the careful look of a man about to recommend caution at someone else's cost. "There was still time to make this a limited trial," he said. "A demonstration only, a prudent beginning." Brunel looked at him. "A demonstration of what?" "That the process had begun." Brunel took the cigar from his mouth. "The process had begun when we first spent money." The man fell quiet. Sensible retreat had many phrases. It never improved by being heard aloud. By late morning the yard had become a theatre. Orders snapped, ropes creaked, winches stood ready. Capstans waited with their teams. Men took positions along the machinery with faces already set hard in the way of labourers who knew they were about to spend themselves on something that might not care. Above and around them the crowd pressed for a better view, all collars, parasols, boots, gossip, wages, and the lively moral interest of people who had risked none of their own skin. Brunel took his place where he could see the ship and the ways together. His gloves were dark with damp. His jaw worked once, twice. "Begin," he said. The first effort went into her like force into a cliff. Capstans turned, chains drew taut, link by link, until they sang. Men leaned into bars, jack screws laboured. The great hole gave out a sound so deep and strained it seemed to come from the yard itself, from timber, mud, iron, and river, all protesting at once. A groan went through the ship, then a shudder, then, so slight half the spectators missed it, a movement. Hope sprang up far too quickly. That was its bad habit. "There!" someone shouted. "She moved!" Brunel did not speak. He watched the skids, watched the line, watched the angle. Another groan, another strain, another inch, perhaps. Then nothing, not a dramatic stop. That would at least have had the decency to be clear. No, she settled into resistance with the full, ugly confidence of dead weight. The chains held, the men held, the machinery bit and bit and bit. The ship stayed where she was, as if all of England had only succeeded in waking her temper. The crowd changed note at once. Excitement thinned into talk. Talk thickened into commentary. Commentary, given time and boots, became mockery. A reporter near the front murmured something to his companion, and both smiled in that small, hungry way men did when a headline began to assemble itself. The boardman returned. "Perhaps," he began. "No," Brunel said. "You had not heard the suggestion." "I had heard its shape." He stepped forward, down among the working men where the yard smelled of tallow, wet wood, iron filings, sweat, and river slime. He crouched by the greased ways, touched the timber with his glove, stood again with a stiffness he disguised as impatience. "More grease here," he said. "Ease that cradle, rebalance the strain on the after-chains. You—" he pointed at the foreman. "Not talk, work." The foreman's mouth twitched, not quite into a smile. "Aye, sir." That was where Brunel was strongest and weakest together, in the instant when difficulty became an order of battle. Give him a wall and he wanted levers. Give him doubt and he wanted men to stop speaking English and begin speaking iron. Around noon, the sky remained a dull, pewter lid over the Thames. The river gave nothing away. The spectators grew colder, bolder, louder. A woman with opera glasses asked whether the ship intended to leave by Christmas. Her husband laughed harder than the line deserved. A child cried. A clerk dropped papers into the muck and nearly wept over the loss of neatness. A vendor sold hot food to people who had come to witness another man's trial and wished to do it comfortably. Brunel heard enough of it to know the mood had turned. Great men were always admired at a distance. Up close, if they slipped, the public liked to count the bruises. The second attempt began harsher, more force, more adjustment, less ceremony now. The launch had been stripped of grandeur and reduced to what it had always secretly been, men wrestling friction with mathematics. Orders cracked out over the yard. The chains came tight again. The timbers answered with shrieks this time, high and splintering, the complaint of stressed wood under impossible persuasion. The hull lurched. That got them. The crowd gasped. Men stumbled. One labourer went to a knee as a line jerked across the wet boards with enough violence to flay a hand to bone. A capstan team swore as one body. The ship moved farther this time, a brutal grudging glide, not dignified, not graceful, but alive enough to frighten. For one raw second, it looked as though the whole monstrous thing had finally agreed to the river. Then the strain changed pitch. A chain snapped loose of its happy assumptions and cracked through the air with the sound of gunfire. Men flung themselves away. Timber banged. Someone shouted for room. The great hull checked itself, shivered, and stopped again. The silence after that was worse than the noise. Not true silence, of course. London never managed such a luxury. There were still bells somewhere on the river, still shouts, still boots on plank, still the muttering of 100 opinions. But at the centre of it, around Brunel and the ship, there opened a pocket of awful recognition. This had become dangerous. The boardmen found courage in that at once, as cautious men always did when danger began supporting their argument. "It could not continue like this," one said. "It should be deferred," said another. "We had proved the method difficult." The foreman, breathing hard, greased to the elbow, cut in before Brunel answered. "Difficult, is it? She nearly took the whole yard with her for a step and a half, and that gentleman called it difficult." The gentleman looked offended by the language, which was a poor exchange for having offered none of the muscle. Brunel turned away from them all. He walked along the hull until the crowd thinned, and the noise broke around the iron instead of striking him full in the face. Under that black side, with the smell of the river and grease and metal heavy in the air, he looked smaller than London liked to imagine him. His hand rested against the plating, cold, damp, unmoved by reputation. For a little moment, almost no one saw him. He coughed once into his glove. The cough stayed with him. So did the ache in his chest, the drag in his limbs, the tiredness that had ceased to be temporary some while ago. He had given years to bridges, tunnels, lines, steam, span, pressure, speed. He had bent earth and distance into obedience often enough to start half believing the world could be stared into arrangement. But this thing had scale enough to answer back. He looked along the length of the ship and knew, with that cold private accuracy pride hated most, that if she defeated him here, she would not merely fail. She would explain him, not the bold engineer, not the conquering builder, not the popular engraving. She would explain him as a man who had finally asked too much of matter and been answered in public. He closed his eyes once, opened them, straightened. When he came back, he did not come back like a broken man. He came back like Brunel, which was not the same thing as safety. "We continued," he said. One of the board men stared. "Mr. Brunel?" "We continued," Brunel said again. "Strip the fuss away. Reset the gear. Hydraulic power on the next effort. Better distribution on the rams. I wanted pressure where it paid, not noise where it comforted spectators." The foreman's eyes narrowed, then sharpened. "Aye. And clear the fools farther back." There was, now and then, a useful democracy in danger. Fine coats moved when iron gave them reason. The next labour was slower, uglier, more method than spectacle, less heroics at the surface, more hard intelligence underneath. Rams set, pressures measured, men repositioned, orders repeated, sweat chilled on backs under wool and leather, grease shone black on palms. Even the crowd quieted, not from respect, but because the business had become too technical to laugh at comfortably. The ship did move again, not with triumph, not with any noble yielding of man and machine in harmonious industrial verse. It moved as if dragged out of a sulk by increments, inch, pause, groan, inch, another shriek from the timber, another watchful pause. Brunel stood fixed on the line of descent as though the rest of the world had blurred to mist around him. Once a cheer rose too early and died of embarrassment. Once a gentleman removed his hat in relief only to have to place it back on almost at once. The yardmen did not waste emotion so cheaply. They knew weight better than rhetoric. By the time the light had begun to go flat toward evening, the great ship had yielded something, but not enough for glory. She had been forced onward, yes, made to admit movement, yes, but the clean public miracle had died hours before. What remained was effort, expense, and the sour knowledge that the monster would not be hurried merely because England wished to clap. Still, Brunel had not retreated. That mattered to him with a ferocity few there fully understood. The crowd drifted off in parcels, carrying away versions of the day to suit themselves. Some said genius had been overpraised. Some said no man alive could have done more. Some complained about the cold. Reporters folded up their notes with the neat satisfaction of men who had harvested disappointment and intended to sell it. Investors counted the future in their heads and found the sum unpleasant. Labourers washed their hands in bad water and looked back at the hull the way soldiers looked back at a field they had not won but had no shame in surviving. Brunel remained until late. The river lay there in the failing light, patient as ever, refusing applause. Smoke dragged over the water. The iron flank of the ship held the dusk and gave back almost nothing. Weeks later, by persistence, altered means, and more punishment than anyone had imagined at the start, the ship did at last reach the Thames. She floated. England got its giant, the world got its marvel, the newspapers got their conclusion. But that was not the true ending of the day at Millwall. The true ending was Brunel on the wet timber, looking up at the black side of the thing he had forced into history, and understanding that victory had come to him like extraction, not triumph. He had not drawn a sword from a stone. He had dragged a cathedral of iron inch by inch through mud, money, friction, and the open mouth of public judgment. The ship reached the water in the end. The river did not give him back what it cost.